3. Stewardship, Investment, and Usury. Financing the Kingdom of God by Gary North. But I hope it will never be complained that the ministers of the gospel are by any sinful silence accessory to the transgressions which deny the doctrine of God our Savior among a people that are under peculiar obligations to adorn it. It shall not be complained that the ministers do so confine themselves to preach faith and repentance, that the people forget moral honesty through any default of ours. Cotton Mather, Fair Dealing Between Debtor and Creditor, 1716. The question of usury is one which has challenged the exegetical skills of Christian commentators for 2,000 years. A considerable proportion of the works devoted to the practical application of Christian principles, casuistry, was devoted to this very issue, from the 12th century through the 17th. Before the Christian era, Hebrew leaders and prophets struggled against the constant pressure of usury. Pre-exilic and post-exilic prophets warned their contemporaries against their continual violations of the Mosaic ordinances regarding lending. Jeremiah, in condemning his brethren for their persecution of him, pointed to his innocence of the crime of usury. I have neither lent on usury, nor men have lent to me on usury, yet every one of them doth curse me. Jeremiah 15:10b. Nehemiah warned the rulers of his day not to extort any usurious returns from God's people, for they were oppressed by the ravages of famine and the costs of redeeming their brethren out of bondage. Nehemiah 5:1-13. The rulers were wise enough to heed his warning, going so far as to return both principal and interest to the debtors. 5:11-12. It is unlikely that this example will be followed in our modern, enlightened Christian circles. Usury, interest, and charity. The prohibition against usury as it appears in the Mosaic Law refers specifically to the brother who is poor. If thou lend money to any of my people that is poor, Exodus 22:25, and if thy brother be waxen poor, Leviticus 25:35. It was legitimate to take a return above the sum lent from the religious stranger, Deuteronomy 23:20. A tenth of this increase would therefore be tithed to God, thereby extracting from the unregenerate at least a portion of the tithe that all men owe to God. As a slave to sin, the stranger was not protected from the bondage imposed on a poor man by every usurious contract. But to the poor Hebrew brother, his lending brother was to show mercy. No increase of any kind beyond the original money or goods could be legitimately claimed by the creditor. Leviticus 25:37. Historically, these restrictions were not acknowledged as binding by the Hebrew Commonwealth. The continual violations of all aspects of the Mosaic Law brought condemnation on the nation. God had not left them without warning. He that hath not given forth upon usury, neither hath taken any increase, that hath withdrawn his hand from iniquity, hath executed true judgment between man and man, hath walked in my statutes, and hath kept my judgments to deal truly. He is just, he shall surely live, saith the Lord God. He that hath given forth upon usury, and hath taken increase, shall he then live? He shall not live. He hath done all these abominations, he shall surely die. His blood shall be upon him. Ezekiel 18:8-9 and 13. The definition of usury is precise biblically. Any increase taken from the poor in return for having made a loan. There is no biblical evidence, nor have Christian casuists generally argued, that the prohibition restricted interest received on business loans, so long as the lender shared the risks of failure along with the borrower. This interpretation of the usury prohibition was basic to the expositions of medieval and early Protestant casuists. By sharing in the risk of a profit-making business, a lender has the right to participate in a portion of the returns. The problem for the casuists came only when the lender was guaranteed a return on his investment, irrespective of the success or failure of the enterprise. The prohibition of usury, as it appears in the Bible, is simultaneously coupled with a requirement that godly men lend to all brethren in truly dire circumstances, Deuteronomy 15:7 and following. This requirement, if it were universally respected, would have a definite impact on the illicit, immoral usury market. People in emergencies would have access to more money and goods than they would have been able to gain access to had the requirement to lend never been given by God. Christians with extra funds are brought into the emergency loan market apart from an economic incentive. With more funds available, the demands of desperate borrowers can be met more readily. Thus, the prevailing rate of return on the usury market is forced lower. Those receiving the charitable loans have no need to enter the usury market, and their presence does not therefore raise rates in that illicit market. They are not bidding up the usury rate because their needs are being met outside of that market. It must be stressed, however, that the kind of emergency described by the relevant passages is a true emergency. It arises when a poor man has nothing left but his cloak, and even that may be legitimately demanded as collateral in the daytime, thus keeping the debtor from using the collateral to secure multiple loans. The emergency is a situation of desperation. Godly men and women are not to indebt themselves for anything less than this. Owe no man anything but to love one another is the binding rule for all non-emergency circumstances, Romans 13:8a. Charity loans were required of affluent believers. Consumer loans at no interest were not contemplated. No one was supposed to ask for them, so there was no requirement to provide them at zero return. It was assumed that consumer loans were products of a slave mentality. From the ethical slave, the stranger, it was legitimate to take interest. Those who did not regard themselves as slaves were, and are, expected to heed the words of Solomon. The rich ruleth over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender, Proverbs 22:7. Operationally, the rate of interest, like all prices, is a product of supply and demand. In a non-monetary economy, it would reflect the supply and demand for goods and services. The presence of money confuses the picture somewhat by adding another factor to the equation, the supply of and demand for money. The fact that these two aspects are present in the single rate of interest can lead to highly concrete practical problems, namely the boom-bust cycle of inflation-depression. For the purposes of this essay, it is not necessary to pursue this dualistic aspect of the interest rate. The problem here is simpler. Why is it that people expect to gain a return above the capital loaned, and why are others willing to pay it? This highly theoretical problem baffled economists for centuries. Professional economists are not yet completely agreed on the subject, but in the last 100 years a general solution has appeared. A man can claim a rate of return on his money or goods loaned out for 3 reasons. First, because he forfeits the use of the money for a given period of time. This is the so-called time preference factor, also called the originary rate of interest. The use of a good right now is more valuable to a person than the promise of the use of that good at a later time, assuming that tastes do not change, of course. Every rational person discounts the value of future economic goods. Men are mortal. They are subject to the burden of time. Each man places a premium on the use of his wealth over time. He will not voluntarily forfeit that use without compensation. His personal time preference sets his discount rate for the enjoyment of future goods and services that his money might buy immediately. That rate of discount sets the rate of interest that he will demand from someone who wants to borrow his money. Because money is more highly valued now than the same amount of future money is valued now, assuming a stable purchasing power for money, some men are willing to pay to get access to money now. A future-oriented society will display a lower rate of interest. Such men do not value the present that much in terms of the future. As a result, the price spread between present money and future money is narrowed. Here is one possible avenue of investigation open for anyone interested in explaining the rapid rates of growth experienced in the past century by the West, and especially the Protestant West. A future-oriented culture produces lower rates of interest, making it easier for capitalist entrepreneurs to gain access to funds for economic development. The second component of the rate of interest is the risk premium. The lender knows that he may not get his money back. The borrower may go bankrupt, or he may run away with the loan. To compensate the lender for his risk, a factor which can be estimated with some accuracy by modern statistical techniques, he demands a payment above and beyond his time preference return. Naturally, in a culture which honors the creditor's claim, the risk premium will be lower. Morality does influence the rate of interest. A society that takes seriously the psalmist's warning with respect to both borrowing and lending will find a godly quote-unquote easy money policy and not a Keynesian inflationary one. The wicked borroweth and payeth not again, but the righteous showeth mercy and giveth. Psalm 37:21. The merciful lender, as we have already seen, helps to keep the illicit usury rate down, and the honest borrower in a business helps to keep the risk premium lower. Christian nations that are not seduced by antinomianism should produce a smaller black market for loans, emergency usurious loans, and a lower interest rate for commercial loans. The third factor is the inflation premium. A lender wants to be paid back in money that will purchase as many goods as the money he lent. In an inflationary society, the lender will add a new demand, enough money to compensate him for the expected fall in the value of the nation's circulating media. Again, if a society honors Isaiah's condemnation of debased precious metals, used by ancient kingdoms as money, and if it also honors the Mosaic law against multiple indebtedness, thus stifling the inflation produced by modern fractional reserve banking, it will not experience much price inflation. In fact, an expanding economy, given a relatively fixed money supply, will produce a gradually falling price level. It could fall enough to lower the money rate of interest, though not the actual rate of interest in terms of purchasing power. A society could conceivably produce a negative money rate of interest if the value of the purchasing power of money were rising at a faster rate than the market's registered rate of time preference plus the risk premium. If you could buy more with the money received in the future, you might need to ask only for an equal amount of paper money or coins as a return. With this as background to the theory of the interest rate, it should be easier to grasp the implications of the charitable loan that comes under the usury prohibition. The lender faces a sure loss on his loan. First, he bears the risks associated with loans to the impoverished, for he can ask no extra payment as a risk premium attached to the rate of interest. Second, he receives back goods in the future, but future goods are less valuable to a man than the same goods in the present. He therefore forfeits the use of his goods over time without any compensation. He receives back less valuable goods, for he has lost the one thing that creatures cannot restore, time. Third, during inflationary times, he also forfeits the lost purchasing power if his loan is one in terms of paper money, as it would normally be. He therefore bears 2 and possibly 3 costs of the loan. That is the extent of his charity. He suffers a loss for the sake of his needy brother. This loss is required of him by God. Stewardship, investment, and charity. The concept of Christian stewardship is a fundamental tenet of the Christian social order. The Bible declares that God is the sovereign owner of all his creation. He delegated the responsibility for the care of the earth to Adam, the representative head of mankind, Genesis 1:28. Throughout the Bible, man is cautioned to exercise dominion over the earth in terms of God's requirements. God's law order is the means by which man is to bring the earth into subjection. Any deviation from this law order involves man in rebellion against God and the destruction of God's property. The great enemy of God, Satan, is pictured in the parable of the tares as the one who violates the rules of planting in order to defy God and to thwart God's plan, Matthew 13:24 and following. The parable of the husbandman who prepared his vineyard and then turned it over to servants who proved to be unfaithful thieves indicates the hostility of God against those who would violate his rights of ownership, Matthew 21:33 and following. The faithful steward is he who treats God's universe with respect, causing it to flower and grow in productivity. He is the one who invests his Lord's money wisely, turning an honest profit, expanding the value of the goods entrusted to him, Matthew 25:14 and following. Yet, he is also a man who should be merciful in his dealings with others, as God has been merciful to him, Matthew 18:23 and following. Faithful stewardship therefore involves, at the minimum, the following. 1. A recognition of the sovereignty of God over his creation. 2. Obedience to the law order God has established for the governing of his creation. 3. The productive, fruitful administration of one's vocation or calling. 4. The recognition of the lawfulness of the tithe in theory and practice. 5. The voluntary giving of alms on a selective, godly basis. Stewardship can be summarized into two overarching principles: calling and charity. The first of the 5 aspects of stewardship, the recognition of the sovereignty of God, is the foundation of both the calling and charity. Charity and calling are linked, and yet they are separate. The principle enunciated by Jesus, "Unto whomsoever much is given, of him shall be much required," indicates the link. Luke 12:48b. God grants plenty to men, his vicegerents on earth, but he expects honesty and charity from them. Men are warned specifically against the great danger of benefiting from the open hand of God only to forget the sovereign demands of the giver. Destruction will be the result. Deuteronomy 8:11 and following. But the distinction between investment and usury stands as a reminder against the fusing of charity into the realm of the calling. One may not make a living through loans to needy brothers. Such a living is an abomination in the sight of God. It is not the case, as one advocate of a totally laissez-faire free market has attempted to argue, that the best form of charity is a profit-making investment in capital which will create jobs. To accept that premise, the Christian would have to blur the God-given distinctions between business and voluntary charity. Business involves an economic return, or at least a potential for making a profit, to the investor. Charity involves the transfer of scarce economic resources to another with no thought of return. Matthew 10:8, Luke 6:35. A man can hardly call himself a faithful steward if he seals off charity from business in an absolute manner. Businesses are supposed to earn profits if they are to be successful, as several parables of Jesus indicate. However, ruthless competition that is utterly devoid of mercy is also condemned in the parables. But the fact that a particular young ruler was told to sell all of his goods and give everything to the poor does not stand as the requirement for every steward. Nor does the example of the church at Jerusalem in Acts 4:32 prevail as the model for all churches. A man must be careful not to drown out the revelation of God in his word, listening only to the parables of profit or only to the examples of total poverty. He is responsible before God to respond to the leading of God's Spirit at different times and along each turn in life's path. We are warned to grow spiritually by means of earthly parables of economic stewardship. The fact that God may demand a man to give up all that he has does not imply that God is sanctioning the moral validity of continual economic losses. What God is saying is that one must not be morally ruthless in business, nor morally wasteful in charity. Share the wealth is a biblical principle, and the normal means of this sharing is the tithe. The general principle is not destroy all wealth through universal indiscriminate giving. In short, business is not charity, though it may be and should be merciful. Charity should be carefully administered in a business-like fashion, with honest accounting, budgeting, etc. But it is not a business, that is, not a profit-making economic endeavor. They are separate sovereign realms. Their differences must be respected. One important difference is in the very bureaucratic structure produced by each form of stewardship. Professor Mises has distinguished two basic models of management. The first is the business form, the one geared to profit and loss statements. It will be characterized by a central entrepreneurial hierarchy that makes the basic decisions as to general goals of the corporation. These goals are transmitted to the lower ranks by professional managers who earn a salary, but who do not participate in the true economic profits. Profits are the residuals left after all costs are met: taxes, salaries, interest, raw materials. It is a residual based on the accurate forecasting of formerly unknown events. Superior forecasters of the future reap profits, while the less efficient take losses. The lower ranks of the bureaucracy are left relatively free to do whatever turns a profit in each subdivision within the general goals of the company. There is far more flexibility at the lower levels, precisely because the magnitude of profit and loss is not rigidly fixed in advance. In contrast to this flexible, risk-oriented free market management is the government bureaucracy, or the non-profit charities bureaucratic structure. They are on fixed allocations determined by taxpayers or givers. These bureaucracies have far less flexible budgets, for they are financed from above. They do not make profits, and they do not sustain losses, at least not in the sense of the profits and losses sustained by a firm in a competitive market. The only way to increase revenues is to get more money from the taxpayers or the donors. This kind of bureaucracy allows far less freedom to lower echelon bureaucrats to spend as they please. They must follow carefully delineated budgets that are fixed in advance. These men are less flexible than their free market counterparts because their budgets are centrally directed, far less flexible, and as a result, the men involved are not subject to the direct competition of the market. To a limited extent, the tax law structure of the United States acknowledges the validity of both Mises's analysis and the biblical separation of business and charity. Non-profit corporations are supposed to be essentially charitable, educational, eleemosynary, service-oriented, cultural, etc. And employees are just that, salaried employees. They are paid in terms of services rendered to the functioning of the corporation. They are not allowed to receive all residuals after all costs are met, and for that reason, the civil government grants to these corporations the right to escape a very important operating cost, taxes. The taxable business, however, is allowed to keep profits for the owners, distributing these profits in any way the owners decide. Charitable organizations pay for services rendered. Profit and loss corporations try to gain for the owners as much profit as possible. Gains from the first are limited, ultimately, by civil law. Gains from the second, except in the case of regulated monopolies or semi-monopolies, are not. The tax laws recognize a distinction between a return for service and a return on an investment. Charity is not business. God's institutional monopoly. At this point, it is mandatory to recognize another distinction. Just as stewardship encompasses both the calling and charity, so the concept of the kingdom of God includes the work of the institutional church and the godly activity of Christian men in all other legitimate human institutions. This point was made clear by the great Dutch thinker Abraham Kuyper when he developed his concept of sphere sovereignty. The Roman Catholic Church is erroneous in equating the kingdom of God with the institutional church. The kingdom is something far wider than the mere dispensing of the sacraments. It involves the work of Christians in all their various activities. A crucial question now appears. Is the institutional church primarily under the rules governing those aspects of the kingdom concerned with profit-making business, or is it more properly under the rules governing the charitable organization? The official answer of the churches has to be that the second alternative is the valid one. The business of the church is not the profit and loss statement. The business of the church is the spreading of the gospel, collective worship under godly discipline, and the administration of the sacraments. The concern of the institutional church is with spiritual income and economic giving. Its concern, unlike the Christian business, is not with spiritual income through economic residuals. Unlike the American fundamentalists' claim that, quote, full-time Christian service, end quote, is limited to the affairs of the institutional church or its missionary appendages, the Calvinist recognizes the validity of all godly callings as full-time Christian service. But the principle of sphere sovereignty requires that we distinguish the nature of each calling in contrast to all others. That which is valid for the Christian businessman is not always valid for the church elder or seminary administrator. Simply because all godly callings are valid, we are not allowed to conclude that all of them are identical. They are governed by different rules, and their successes and failures are estimated by different standards. If any example in the Bible stands out as the premier example, it is the account of Christ and the temple money changers. The money changers, as the name indicates, were in the business of foreign currency exchange. Part of the annual sacrifice requirements of the Mosaic Law was the offering of a census payment of half a shekel of silver, Exodus 30, 12-15. Jerusalem was flooded with visiting Hebrews from all over the Mediterranean during the Passover, adding to an already diverse population. Compare Acts 2:5 and following. Various coins from many lands would have to be converted to the proper offering, the shekel. The money changers performed this service, and as the hostility of Jesus indicates, they did so at a profit. What was their crime? The gaining of profit from foreign exchange transactions is an old and respected profession. The most rigorous of the medieval commentators allowed banks to make profits from this service. This was considered banking's foremost legitimate function. Why the overwhelming hostility of Jesus against them? The reason almost certainly lies in the location of their tables. They were set up in the outer court of the temple. The presence of the temple added an obvious, unmistakable aura of holy sanctity to the men whose services were being offered there. The visiting Hebrews would not have to deal with Gentile money changers on the outside. They could trust the men of the temple, or so they thought. An implicit, and in all likelihood, an explicit, demand was being made by the rulers of the temple. The sacrifices required by God should be obtained from the money changers and dove salesmen inside the jurisdiction of the Lord's house. The money changers were reaping a monopoly return because of their close connection to the institutional church. They were not subject to the competitive pressures of a free market in money exchange. They were shielded by the name of God. By so using God's name, they dishonored Him. Monopoly profits are not to be earned in this way. We can only surmise that the rates of exchange were unfavorable in comparison to rates available outside the temple court. We can only acknowledge the fact that the power to reap monopoly economic returns is one which is unlikely to be ignored over long periods of time. Again, we can only surmise that the money changers churned a portion of their profits over to the temple authorities. It would seem reasonable that temple authorities would demand a cut of monopoly returns that had their origin in the very aura of the temple. It is possible that the money changers were even salaried employees of the temple. But whatever the concrete economic arrangements, Christ's words made their position in God's eyes quite clear. "It is written, 'My house shall be called the house of prayer,' but you have made it a den of thieves." Matthew 21:13. The dove salesmen, the money changers, those who bought, those who sold, Jesus cast them all out of the court. Such economic transactions were an abomination. The house of God had its support in the tithes and offerings of His people. He did not sanction huckstering in His name as a means of increasing quote-unquote holy revenues. The institutional church is the means of preaching the gospel, disciplining the saints, and administering the sacraments. It is quite openly a spiritual monopoly. It is the monopoly in men's affairs. Christ made it clear that this position of monopoly is not to be exploited by men for their own profit. Payment to God's ordained servants in the service of the institutional church is for services rendered. Economic returns to the church are not to be in terms of the principle made famous in Frank Norris's book, The Octopus, quote, "all the traffic will bear," end quote. The institutional church is not a business, not a money-changing business, not a bingo business, and not an insurance business. It is the house of prayer. Men who come in the name of the Lord and who claim the prerogatives granted to His ordained must be scrupulously careful to distinguish their profit-making callings from their service callings. Paul was a tent maker. He did not use his position as an apostle to reap monopoly returns from the brethren. He did not market his wares under the auspices of the local church, charging a price higher than the market price because he was ordained. He kept his trade because he desired to relieve the institutional church of the economic burden of supporting him, not because he intended to set up Apostolic Tents Incorporated, available only at your local church. The institutional church and its related institutions possess legitimate but limited sovereignty. When this sovereignty, a monopoly grant from God, is transgressed, a violation of God's law order occurs. The institutional church then becomes a destroyer, a thief. The institutional church is not a business, it is the house of prayer. Christian usury. With this as background, it is time to turn to that practice which is euphemistically known as, quote, the Christian Stewardship Program, end quote. It has many facets and many, many practitioners. It involves virtually every Protestant denomination. It involves mission societies, institutions of Christian learning, medical aid societies, and Christian charities. Almost any denominational magazine will contain, in any given issue, several appeals for loans of various kinds. There is one contemporary magazine, the official publication of a supposedly reformed denomination of 250,000 members, that runs almost a dozen such advertisements every issue. When I began to gather data on these quote-unquote stewardship programs, I sent out requests to various Protestant organizations for booklets, charts, or other information. The data poured in, and always by first-class mail. Personal letters were sent, and every letter offered to supply further information on request. Then came the telephone calls and the personal visits by quote-unquote stewardship expediters. I had 2 such visits within a month, and I live in an isolated part of a town that is many miles from the offices of the men who came by to talk to me. In my first 10 years as a Christian, I had 1 visit from a local church's elders. That was initiated by the request of the denomination's multimillionaire who insisted that they visit me. I was not home at the time, and they never returned or phoned. But the interest that was shown to me when I inquired about quote-unquote stewardship. I was a man whose Christian soul needed the uplifting experience of true Christian fellowship. An 80-mile round trip was not too far to drive. One would almost be led to conclude that God was wrong, that we can serve God and mammon. It is almost as if God had said that He came that men might have profits, and that they might have them more abundantly. Indeed, here were men who were really involved in, quote, full-time Christian service, end quote. What surprised me initially was the remarkable similarity of these programs. The tax laws apparently create this uniformity. Some of these programs use the very same pamphlet, but with their own name stamped or printed on the folder. They offer the prospective steward many ways of giving. Here are a few of the titles of the brochures: Faithful Stewardship Through Christian Investment, World Vision; Christian Living, Stewardship Giving, Inseparably Linked, Christian and Missionary Alliance; Effective Giving Through Gift Annuities, Bible Study Hour. The grotesque link among quote-unquote investment, stewardship, and giving is so open, so incredibly blatant, that it should shock the sensibilities of all Christians. Obviously, it doesn't. A confusion of biblical categories so thorough, so willful, and so profitable financially in the short run would be difficult to match. The supposedly conservative Orthodox denominations and ministries are right back in the roaring 20s world of Bruce Barton, where Jesus could be considered seriously as, quote, the founder of modern business, end quote. Usury, in its biblical definition, involves the loaning of money to the needy brother and then demanding a repayment of principal plus interest. The question then arises as to the status of the institutional church. I assume that it has already been established that this institution is not to be regarded as a profit-making business. Therefore, to demand the payment of interest by a church for any kind of loan offered to it is a usurious demand. The hierarchy of the church is equally guilty, for the Bible makes it plain that it is immoral to enter into such a transaction, either as lender or borrower. Jeremiah 15:10b. The institutional church must be regarded as a charitable ministry, something to be supported by the tithes and offerings of its members. It is not comparable to a corporation. It is not to be financed through the sales pitches of hucksters who offer misleading hopes to elderly couples, as I intend to demonstrate, and who offer them usurious contracts, quote-unquote, guaranteed annual returns for life, or any other of a multitude of schemes dreamed up by insurance companies and congressional tax committees. Interest may be taken from businessmen who need to raise money to launch some hopefully profitable enterprise. Interest becomes, biblically, usury when it is taken from charitable, legally nonprofit firms that are not operating in a competitive market in order to increase revenues, but which are in fact distributing revenues in the name of God. Stewardship is undoubtedly involved in the support of the church and its appendages, but it is the stewardship of charity rather than the stewardship of a profitable calling. To transfer the concept of the stewardship of business to that of charity, thereby justifying usurious loan contracts, is nothing short of blasphemy. He who accepts such a loan is as guilty as he who offers it. The request for loans to support the work of the church is legitimate in times of emergency, just as the appeal is valid for an impoverished individual. It is not legitimate otherwise. But an appeal for a loan at interest is always usurious, always immoral, and always under the curse of God, if it is made in terms of the need for charity. Men can shut their eyes and stop up their ears, but that is what the Bible affirms. There is no escape from the truth. God only delays the judgment. The issue of the so-called life income contracts is more difficult to assess, at least for the person who has not had some training in economic theory. Consider the booklet published by Charitable Giving Publications and distributed by a leading conservative seminary and the Bible Study Hour. It is written by Robert Sharp. The seminary version is dated 1967, and the Bible Study Hour version is dated 1968. It presents the case for gift annuities. These contracts involve the payment of a lump sum in cash. The institution uses these funds, and it pays the investor a stated annual return in dollars until he dies. On his death, the remaining money in the fund, if any, goes to the surviving husband or wife, or else it goes to the institution, depending upon the type of contract signed. We are informed by the booklet, quote, "You accomplish two main purposes with a gift annuity. First, you make a gift to a charity, an educational or other charitable organization. Such organizations must meet certain qualifications for your gift to offer you the tax advantages discussed later. Second, you are providing yourself with a regular and assured income." End quote. Both statements are misleading. A gift is a present sacrifice made to a charity or a person without any thought of return. It is not the same, morally or legally, as a legacy after death, as any tax collector will be careful to explain. A gift involves the sacrifice of the living donor, not the sacrifice of his surviving relatives. That, at least, is the biblical idea of a gift. An investment is not a gift either. For example, an annuity may be taken out with a commercial insurance company, a fact admitted in the brochure. Is this to be regarded as a gift to Prudential or John Hancock? Is it not rather a form of risk-taking, with the insurance company betting that you will not outlive the actuarial average life expectancy for someone of your age group and sex? Is the company not betting that the accumulated interest on your money plus the principal will be greater at your death than the payments made to you during your lifetime? If the contracts are the same, why does a person go to a church or a missionary organization to make provisions for his, quote, lifetime income, end quote? Because the church comes to him in the name of the Lord. The church calls his investment a gift, calls his risk-taking charitable stewardship, calls his usury commendable. A commercial insurance organization does not bear the name of Christ, and it must pay taxes on its profits. It is not really so competitive among the faithful as the church's insurance scheme is. Like the money changers, the church's insurance salesmen and loan brokers are, quote, inside the temple court. The church possesses that crucial spiritual monopoly, and its administrators have learned that such a spiritual monopoly can be easily converted into a very successful, in the short run, economic monopoly. Is this an exaggeration? Listen to the words of Mr. Stanley L. Bjornson of the Christian and Missionary Alliance in that organization's official pamphlet promoting the Treasures Tomorrow program. Quote, "We call it Treasures Tomorrow, adapted from Christ's injunction to lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Of course, many financial plans offered by the Alliance provide income opportunities for the near future, others in years to come. All, however, are investments in behalf of God's work, which He has promised to bless." End quote. Naturally, these organizations prefer an outright gift to an investment, which requires them to repay something to the investor. But donors are not always able to meet the needs of the various organizations, so potential usurers in the audience must be encouraged to embark on a new, more immediately profitable path to quote-unquote charitable giving. Ezekiel was no doubt right in his day to condemn such practices, but then he was, quote, under law, not grace, end quote. We supposedly live in a new dispensation, as Mr. Bjornson indicates, quote, "The best gift possible, of course, is the outright gift, which becomes immediately available for use. However, many Christians, quote, yearn to give, but need earnings to live. For them, income-giving gifts, annuities, or trusts are preferable and beneficial. It is our sincere desire to serve all who wish to lay up treasures in heaven by giving and investing in the Lord's work today." End quote. Christians who play such games with language are laying up something in heaven, no doubt, and perhaps they will be skillful enough to convince themselves on earth that the thing being stored up for them is a treasure, but there will come a day of accounting. Whether their stores are treasures or not will be examined by fire, 1 Corinthians 3:12 and following. So the pastors of the flock make usurers of the sheep. In order to gain funds for their quote-unquote kingdom projects, the pastors have turned the house of prayer into a den of thieves, all for a good purpose, of course. The truth or falsity of the Bible stand against usury is not even a topic for consideration. Men skilled in the most torturous kind of detailed biblical exegesis, men trained in the original biblical languages, men who can spot a flaw in a creedal formulation in an instant, find themselves unconcerned with the practical issue of usury. That is the blight of antinomian pietism: precision in things narrowly theological, utter blindness in anything beyond the scholar's footnote. Its product is cultural impotence. The years of studied irrelevance catch up to a church. The pastors are no longer capable of applying biblical norms, even in the narrow realm of the institutional church. The standards of the world of high finance are assumed, a priori, to be eminently transferable to the world of the institutional church. If the tax authorities, once called publicans, grant to non-profit corporations certain tax advantages on annuity programs, that is assumed to sanction the practice in God's eyes, and indebtedness, like a narcotic, is very difficult to abandon once the practice is begun. Those lifetime annuities must be paid off in part by the financing of more lifetime annuities. That is the modern way. Owe no man anything but to love one another is disregarded. That was for first century Rome, not for modern times. We live in a new dispensation. Inflation and annuities. Risk is basic to all life. Nothing on earth is a quote-unquote sure thing. Society has devised many institutions to predict the future and to spread risk, and the insurance company is the most notable of these institutions. A no-risk contract is a contradiction in terms. Companies go bankrupt, disasters strike, people steal money and disappear. Governments devalue currencies or freeze accounts in banks. There are low-risk investments, but never no-risk ones. Consider the implications of the statement by Mr. Bjornson in answer to the question, "What is a charitable gift annuity?" Quote, "This is the transfer of money, securities, or property to a charity in return for a guaranteed income for life. The amount of fixed income depends upon the donor's age at the time of the gift. In addition to certain tax benefits, the donor has the assurance of regular income, free from investment concern and economic fluctuations." End quote. The World Vision Organization is almost as blatant in its promises concerning the safety of the quote-unquote donor's so-called quote-unquote gift. Quote, "An annuity provides a fixed income for life and makes it unnecessary to concern yourself with personal management of the transferred funds. Annuities offer financial security, and because of a saving on taxes, give you additional funds for the Lord's work." End quote. Ah, the wonders of risk-free living, giving, and investment. The mass-produced, effective giving through so-and-so's gift annuities pamphlet spells out the nature of the contract in glowing terms. Quote, 1. You have an income which you cannot outlive. It is for your lifetime, plus you are giving support to this organization. 2. You have an income which will never be reduced. It is set at the time you make the gift, and it cannot be changed. End quote. Here is the financial world's answer to the perpetual motion machine: an income which will never be reduced. What a marvelous promise to some elderly couple. They lived through the Depression, and like so many of their generation, that experience left permanent scars on them. They think of economic catastrophe in terms of collapsing prices and low pay. Europeans of their same generation know better. The more normal form of economic catastrophe is inflation, where pensions and savings accounts are wiped out by the depreciation of a nation's currency. But in America, the appeal is made to the terror that is available, and that terror is the absence of monetary income. So, the Effective Giving pamphlet presents the reader with a totally meaningless economic statement, quote, "Increasingly, the American economy is based on income rather than wealth." End quote. The sales pitch is then made for the safety of guaranteed income. The unsophisticated are encouraged to sign the irrevocable contract. Their savings are permanently transferred by law to the organization in return for a fixed money payment, annual, semi-annual, or quarterly. One unstated premise underlies the promise of permanent income. Income in dollars is the economic equivalent to income in goods and services. The assumption is made by the buyer of the contract, the so-called donor, that the purchasing power of money income will remain stable over the remainder of his lifetime. He is involved in a form of gambling, although the unsophisticated person may not be aware of this gamble. He is betting his savings on the huge gamble that there will be no more monetary inflation by the civil government, and therefore prices will remain stable or even fall. That gamble, since at least 1965, has been a very poor one. It is worse than poor. It is suicidal. From 1958 through 1968, the increase in the American money supply exceeded 90%. Prices are rising at an annual rate of over 6%. This rate will climb much higher in the 1970s and 1980s. Only price and wage controls will call a halt to this visible increase in prices, and the controls will destroy many segments of our free market economy. Inflation has become a way of life for Americans, both politically and economically. Usury is a crime against God. Today, Christians have become usurers in response to the appeals of their leaders. They are no doubt sinning in ignorance. The fact remains, however, that they are involved in rebellion against God's law order, and there is judgment coming. The miracle of God's universe is its marvelous regularity. Its lawfulness is beyond human comprehension. Those who have purchased such usurious contracts have made an economically irrevocable decision. Their hopes are being eaten away by inflation. Their real income is steadily dropping as value of money tumbles. The usurers are being destroyed by inflators. God will not be mocked. The American Institute for Economic Research, AIER, a respected investment service, is noted for its conservative attitude towards highly speculative investments. The Institute has published a study of the various forms of annuities, evaluating each separately. The retirement annuities, whereby a man sets aside a large sum of money, transfers it to the corporation in question, and waits for, say, 25 years for it to mature, at which time he receives a fixed payment for life, is evaluated as follows. Quote, "From an investment point of view, the interest earned on the annual premiums is not especially favorable, because the guaranteed return over a long period of years is less than that paid by most savings banks. If there is any substantial improvement in the average length of life in the future, the option on an annuity may be valuable. On the other hand, probable inflation and the threat of another devaluation of the dollar indicate that deferred contracts of this nature may not be favorable." End quote. Recent reports made available to the news media by the federal government have announced that a marked drop in the average life expectancy for males over 5 years old has appeared. The pressures of industrial life, coupled, one suspects, with the physically degenerative effects of processed foods, have combined to reduce the average life expectancy for males by as much as 5 years. So, the purchaser of a deferred annuity loses both ways. He lives a shorter life and is paid off in depreciated currency. Quote, "Strictly as an investment," the Institute goes on to say, "most retirement annuities are not especially desirable. The interest yield to the maturity of the policy is lower than probably can be obtained from a wise selection of other investments." End quote. The study adds this warning, quote, "During an inflationary period, funds should be invested principally in the types of securities that will tend to preserve purchasing power." End quote. Publications sent by the Institute since the issuing of this one indicate that in the opinion of the Institute's staff, runaway inflation is now a distinct possibility. The higher the rate of inflation, the poorer the investment in annuities of any kind. The AIER staff recommends that elderly people purchase Swiss annuities only, April 19, 1971. Since the economic effect of inflation on annuities and other kinds of insurance contracts, as well as on long-term loans, is to destroy the investor's capital, should the churches continue to promote such contracts, even if they were not usurious, which they are? Can the church's leaders afford not to analyze the causes and effects of inflation, and then bring the warning to their flocks? Does not this aspect of preaching fall under the general requirement of preaching the whole counsel of God? The answer of most of our pastors today is simple: no. When R.J. Rushdoony spoke in a church on the nature of inflation at a special midweek conference, he received a letter from a pastor who was critical of such a message even being presented inside the church's building. On another such occasion, one minister was threatening to have him publicly disciplined by his denomination for having narrated a film strip critical of the inflationary policies of the Federal Reserve System. Any number of arguments can be used by the antinomian clergy against this kind of preaching. Quote, "Separation of church and state, and never mind about our tax law break." The Bible doesn't talk about inflation. The Bible isn't a textbook of economics. We're under grace, not law. So they continue to lead their unsophisticated, trusting congregations into usury and economic self-destruction. No warnings are offered. No attempt is made to abandon the loan contracts. There is every evidence in our churches today of judicial blindness, a curse imposed by God comparable to the one promised by Isaiah and administered by Christ. By hearing ye shall hear and shall not understand, and seeing ye shall see and shall not perceive. Matthew 13:14. Irrevocable lifetime annuities in the context of mass inflation is irrevocable economic suicide. A pastor who fails to warn his flock of this fact, thus exposing the lies printed in his own denomination's huckstering pamphlets, is nothing but a destroyer, a wolf in sheep's clothing, who seeks to impoverish the weakest members of his congregation. The pastors have become proponents of pauperization, encouragers of usury. They are the middlemen of economic whoredom. By validating a wholly illegitimate transfer of moral business practices to the realm of the institutional church, they have become financial pimps. Hierarchical autonomy. Hayek, in his masterful book, The Road to Serfdom, includes a chapter entitled, Why the Worst Get on Top. His argument is that centralized power, especially economic power, is a lure for the most unscrupulous men in society. He believes that by the very fact of the concentration of economic power in the sphere of civil government, a strong impulse toward totalitarian rule is established. What he says about the civil government could be easily applied to any non-market, essentially non-competitive religious institution. The more economic power that is lodged at the higher levels of the bureaucratic hierarchy, the less responsive will the leaders be to the demands of the membership. Grant any such organization a large degree of financial autonomy, and it becomes a likely target for takeover by the unscrupulous. The 20th century has witnessed the liberalization of virtually every Christian church, both Protestant and Catholic. Theological liberalism and political liberalism have been cooperating partners. A major factor in the success of the conversion of the churches to unorthodox creeds and actions is clearly the hearts of the congregational members. They have listened to the false prophets in the pulpits, complaining only when their leaders' radicalism has infringed on some cultural or economic preserve dear to the hearts of particular members. But a crucial institutional factor leading to the takeover has been the existence of endowed agencies within the churches, mission boards, educational institutions, denominational publishing houses, and so forth. The financial autonomy from the weekly contributions of the members has been a basic means of subversion. Part of this autonomy is provided by the irrevocable annuity schemes and long-term loan contracts. These favor the perpetuation of the institution in question, apart from the theological commitment of the institution. Its future supposedly rests more on income from, quote, prudent investments, end quote, than on the preservation of its original theological standards. This, of course, is inevitable, given the nature of the trust agreements as indicated by the following sales pitch, quote, long after you have gone home to heaven, your influence can live on here on earth. A gift to missions, to the ongoing work of the worldwide church, can mean that your Christian influence will live on through the years in dedicated hearts, hands, and feet of the servants of Christ in the far corners of the earth, end quote. What an irresistible appeal for some elderly, unsophisticated widow who has a few $1,000s saved. And what a curse to the organization which offers her the appeal. It is sealing its own doom theologically. The structure may survive, but the goals will change. Perpetual annuities and trusts reverse the promise of Solomon, the wealth of the sinner is laid up for the just, Proverbs 13:22b. Instead, we find that the wealth of the just is laid up for the sinner. The hypocrisy of the appeal to the elderly Christian to part with his money like this should be manifest. The donor, or in this case, the usurer, is led to believe that the institution, in and of itself, can and will maintain its commitment to the establishment of God's kingdom. What the institution needs, the donor-usurer is told, is a permanent fund. The fund is crucial, and not a commitment to theology. Theology will take care of itself. What is needed is money. The fund must expand, even if this means that Christians are turned into usurers, and economically imprudent usurers at that, given the fact of inflation. If the fund can just be built up, the leaders will be able to operate irrespective of the hostility of the membership. The threat of funds cut off cannot exercise the same force. God saved the fund. Financial autonomy of the hierarchy of an institution is the death knell of its original goals. There were many reasons why all debts were canceled in the Old Testament every 7th year. Surely this was one of them. The civil government, the banks, in whatever form they took, the lenders, the debtors, and all other institutions were prohibited from living in terms of perpetual debt and quote-unquote irrevocable annuities, whether secular or usurious. The prohibition must have helped to preserve the responsibility of the bureaucrats of all kinds to the wishes of the people, just as the requirement of the tithe kept the people from becoming tyrants. Plural sovereignties were protected by the various provisions of the law. Each had its own rights, and each had its own limitations. None was to become permanent apart from the continuous renewal of God and continual acknowledgement of His sovereignty as absolute. The essence of Christian stewardship is simply this: full-time, irrevocable, personal responsibility before God. By their very nature, irrevocable trusts and annuities involve both quote-unquote giver, usurer, and debtor in revocable theological responsibility. The rate of interest may be irrevocable and utterly impersonal, but that is the only part of the arrangement that is. Christians are not allowed the luxury of such quote-unquote stewardship, for this kind of irrevocable finance is the abolition of Christian stewardship. There is justice in all of this. The churches that have been too mild and quote-unquote tolerant to demand that their members tithe, though of course not to the church alone, which would be illegitimate biblically, find themselves making usurers of their members because funds are so scarce. Too soft-hearted to enforce the law of the tithe, they have been utterly ruthless in devising a whole complex of usury schemes. But, in doing so, they have linked their impersonal economic futures, their irrevocable external quote-unquote protection, to the survival of an inflationary economy. When price and wage controls are imposed, the endowments, full of blue chips, will fast turn into buffalo chips. These controls destroy both stocks and bonds. To the extent that our Christian institutions have participated in the quote-unquote economic genius of the modern world, they will perish in terms of such genius. They will learn to their dismay that guaranteed prosperity, like guaranteed income for the widows, is never so simple as it seems. Debts incurred in faith of perpetual economic expansion cannot but fail in the long run. There is no such thing as linear, irreversible, irrevocable growth of population, of money in the bank, of new members, or the rate of interest. At some point, mathematical law informs us the exponential curve flattens out or falls. Judgment is coming. The pitfalls of huckstering. Where will it all end? An indication of where we are going came to me in the mail, unsolicited under the postage paid stamp of a nonprofit organization. The organization is Palatine Missionaries of Baltimore, Maryland. I shall quote from the envelope itself. Quote, Postmaster, contents, sweepstakes notification numbers enclosed, $14,000 sweepstakes. You have 5 chances to win 112 prizes. On the back, 2 1970 Oldsmobiles or $3,500 cash, 100 Kodak movie cameras or $35, 10 color TVs or $350 cash. Inside was the promotional, quote, Today may be your lucky day. Why such a fantastic giveaway? Because a group of supporters of the Palatine missions got together and came up with the bright idea of donating all the prizes, tax deductible, of course, Gary North. God bless them, and just think you may be a winner. Why a sweepstakes? Simply to call attention in a dramatic way to the needs of the poor, hungry, and sick children in the Palatine missions. Mail me your contribution today. A person with a heart full of love has always something to give, especially to help children. Just as loving never empties the heart, giving never empties the purse. End quote. When Bruce Barton wrote The Man Nobody Knows half a century ago, he was trying to bring a degree of sanctity into the world of business. He was trying to prove, however ludicrously, that Jesus was a successful organizer, and he was worth imitating even if a man were in business. Barton's liberal theology at least let him try to bring ethics into business, although it involved a rewriting of church history. Today, all good pastors, liberal or conservative, officially ridicule Barton's book, if they have ever heard of it. Yet they have become far more perverse than Barton. They are not telling the businessman to imitate Jesus. They are trying to convince the followers of Jesus to imitate the businessman, and not the ethical businessman, but the huckster. Tell the half-truth, unchanging income, permanent for life, but get that contract signed. Promise those color television sets, but make sure the sheep empty those wallets that never empty. Tell you what I'm going to do. This week and this week only, all your money down, but a whole lifetime to get it back. The institutional church is not an insurance company. It is not a raffle service. It is not a place for bingo, even Protestant bingo. It is a house of prayer. The Riverside, California Press Enterprise, August 29, 1970, printed a column under Religion Today by Reverend Lester Kinsolving. The article was run under this headline, Shearing of the Sheep. Mr. Kinsolving provided a whole rogues gallery of ordained fundamentalist ministers who promoted the sale of bonds, in this case, Baptist bonds. The church bond market today is a $500 million market. Kinsolving writes, quote, potential investors were promised an opportunity to, quote, do your Christian duty at 7% by investing in bonds issued by BBU, Bethel Baptist University. Quote, a high-caliber, accredited university that doesn't mock God, teach apism, or wreck the student's faith. Pious investors poured more than $1 million into this Oklahoma enterprise, only to learn after its operators had vanished that it had never been accredited and that its final enrollment had been for students. Such shearing of the sheep is no rarity. One promoter arranged a $20,000 bond issue for a small Arkansas church, but sold $40,000 worth, skipping town with the difference. The Golden Circle Gospel Federation sold $44,000 worth of what it claimed were church bonds, and then tried to invest the money in a Santa Barbara oil exploration firm when the Securities and Exchange Commission caught up with them. Claude M. Bond of Gideon Church Builders was permanently enjoined from selling bonds issued by 30 churches in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. The SEC charged that Bond had misled investors by telling them, quote, there has never been a known defaulted church bond. Not only investors, but many state and municipal governments have proven exceptionally naive about such practices. For church sponsorship of such bond issues often means there is no requirement that the stock be registered or backed up with evidence of the institution's ability to repay. End quote. Horrifying? Exceptional? What else should Christians expect when churches encourage the violation of God's imposed limitations on the members, the hierarchy, and the type of financing legitimate for each aspect of God's kingdom? Protestants may complain that such examples of defaulting or huckstering are not typical. That is not the point, however. What is crucial is not the fact that these fundamentalist quote-unquote entrepreneurs may be in control of only a small percentage of church trust funds. What is crucial is that the churches establish the funds in the first place. It is not simply that the churches are not so efficient as General Motors is in the handling of their internal and external debt. What is intolerable is that they should imitate the kind of debt contracts that General Motors, as a profit-making business, finds it profitable to agree to. General Motors is not the institutional church, and it is not under the same restrictions regarding the giving and taking of interest. General Motors, unlike the institutional church, is not a house of prayer.